Fire pops in the stove. Coffee steams in my hands. Pine creaks outside this old cabin. That's how quiet sounds when you think you're safe. I learned something after leaving the battlefield, brothers. Walking away from war doesn't mean the war walks away from you. Sometimes silence is louder than gunfire. Sometimes the quiet is where the danger waits. I was working nights on the docks. Red and black flannel, old limp, service dog at my heel. Felt like a safe zone. Then the knock came. Not on the door, on the system. A plan whispered behind glass. A small accident. One worker sacrificed. That's a breach. So let me ask you this, brother to brother. When the wall closes in, do you run? Or do you hold the line and become the guardian? Sit down, warm your hands, listen close. There's a lesson here that keeps you alive when the quiet turns hostile. The Night Watcher. Rain drifted in from Puget Sound, thin and relentless, soaking the docks of Tacoma and turning the harbor lights into blurred streaks of white and amber. Daniel Mercer moved through the perimeter gate of Harbor Line Logistics with the steady rhythm of habit. 40 years had shaped his body into something solid and spare. Tall frame, broad shoulders, a slight drag in his left leg that never quite went away. He wore a red and black flannel shirt under a dark security jacket, the fabric faded from years of washing. Brown work boots met the wet concrete without sound. At his side walked Rex. The German Shepherd was 5 years old, black and tan, large and powerful, with the quiet confidence of an animal trained for work, not applause. A black harness hugged his chest, the white lettering impossible to miss. Service dog, do not pet. Rex did not look at passing forklifts or the glow of the warehouse windows. His eyes tracked movement. His ears read the rain. Dan preferred nights like this. Fewer people, fewer words, less pretending. The guard shack clock read 11:48 p.m. He signed in, nodded once to the day supervisor, and stepped back into the rain. Harbor Line spread out before him like a steel maze. Container stacks, loading bays, long warehouse roofs humming with machinery. The place smelled of oil, salt, and damp wood. Honest smells. He checked the first fence line while Rex paced one step ahead, leash loose. The dog stopped once, sniffed the air, then continued. Dan trusted that more than any sensor. He had not planned to stay in Tacoma this long. After leaving the Navy SEALs, plans stopped working the way they used to. A man learned to settle. Security work paid the bills. It asked for silence and attention, two things Dan had in surplus. His radio crackled once. Routine check. Nothing unusual. At 12:17 a.m., a yellow alert blinked on his handheld unit. Motion sensor, 3rd floor, administrative wing. Not urgent. Still worth a look. Dan adjusted his jacket and headed inside. Rex fell into position without command. The administrative building was warmer, quieter. Carpet muted their steps. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Dan climbed the stairs at a measured pace, left leg protesting in its familiar way. He ignored it. Pain was background noise. The 3rd floor hallway was empty. Glass-walled offices lined one side, conference rooms the other. Most of the executives were long gone by this hour. That was how they liked it. As they passed the main conference room, Rex slowed. Dan felt it before he understood it. A shift in the air. Rex's ears lifted. His body stiffened just enough. Dan stopped. Light spilled from beneath the conference room door. Voices filtered through, low and controlled. Dan did not move closer. He did not press his ear to the door. He stood where he was, hand resting lightly on the radio, listening without trying to. 3 men were inside. The first voice belonged to Caleb Monroe, Chief Operating Officer, early 50s, medium height, always dressed sharp, even during casual walkthroughs. Clean haircut, calm smile. The kind of man who shook hands like he meant it. Caleb sounded relaxed now, confident. "It has to look mechanical," he said. "No drama, no heroics." A second voice replied, tighter, faster. Evan Brooks, the Chief Financial Officer. Late 40s, slim build, wireframe glasses. Known for numbers, not people. "The insurance will cover it if the logs show a delay," Evan said. "We control the timeline. We control the cost." The third man spoke last. Thomas Hale, Vice Chairman of the Board. 60, silver hair. Slow, careful words. A man used to being listened to. "Make sure it's someone replaceable," Thomas said. "No management. No lawsuits that linger." Dan felt his jaw tighten. Inside the room, the men talked about containers, about safety protocols, about how a temporary failure could justify permanent cuts. A controlled accident. 1 injured worker. Maybe 2. Acceptable losses, spoken with the ease of ordering dinner. Dan's hand curled slowly into a fist. Rex did not growl. He did not bark. He leaned slightly into Dan's leg, steady and present. Dan had heard conversations like this before. Not in boardrooms. In different places, under different skies. Men explaining away consequences. Men who believed distance made them clean. He stepped back, careful, silent. The hallway camera in the corner blinked red. He knew that one. He had fixed it himself months ago. Rewired it when no one noticed. It recorded more than the official system logged. Dan continued his patrol as if nothing had happened. He did his job. Checked doors. Logged timestamps. Let the rain wash the docks clean. But something had shifted. By the time his shift ended, the harbor looked the same. Steel, water, lights. Yet Dan knew that plans had been made behind glass walls, and those plans would move fast. People like Caleb Monroe believed regret came later, if at all. Dan Mercer knew better. Some choices came back immediately. He clipped Rex's leash shorter as they headed toward the parking lot. The dog glanced up at him once, reading the tension in his shoulders. "Easy," Dan murmured, more to himself than to the dog. The night was only beginning. The conversation that shouldn't exist. Morning came wrapped in low clouds, the kind that pressed down on Tacoma until the city felt smaller than it was. Daniel Mercer sat in his truck outside Harbor Line Logistics, engine off, rain ticking softly against the windshield. The red and black flannel stretched across his shoulders as he leaned back, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other absently rubbing the stiff muscle above his left knee. The limp was worse in the cold. It always was. Rex lay across the back seat, head up, eyes alert. The black harness stayed on even off duty. Service dog, do not pet. Dan never removed it unless they were home. Habit, structure, boundaries. Sleep had been short and shallow. Every time Dan closed his eyes, he heard voices. Calm, educated, dangerous. He replayed the hallway moment again and again, not searching for drama, only for accuracy. He had learned long ago that memory could lie when fear pushed too hard. But fear was not what he felt. It was something colder. Recognition. Inside the building, daylight revealed what night concealed. Clean glass, polished floors, executives' offices arranged like shrines to success. The same men who spoke of acceptable losses now smiled at assistants and joked about coffee. Dan walked his route, posture neutral, eyes down. Invisible, just as they preferred. Near the elevator bank, he saw Caleb Monroe step out, phone pressed to his ear. The COO looked immaculate as always. Gray suit, white shirt. No tie today. Relaxed confidence in every movement. Caleb noticed Dan only long enough to nod. "Morning," Caleb said, voice warm. "Morning, sir," Dan replied. The elevator doors closed. Caleb disappeared upward. Dan's jaw tightened. Rex sensed it and shifted closer, brushing Dan's leg with his flank. In the security office, Dan logged his shift change and reviewed the previous night's footage. Most guards trusted the automated system. Dan did not. He pulled up the feed from the third-floor hallway. The camera angle he had repaired months ago gave him more than policy allowed. It always had. There it was, time-stamped. Clean audio, faint but clear enough. 3 silhouettes behind frosted glass. 3 voices. Dan did not feel satisfaction. He felt weight. Reporting it meant stepping into a world he had spent years avoiding. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood hierarchy. Chains of command. How quickly a man without rank became a problem instead of a witness. Still, he copied the file, saved it to a secured drive, logged the sensor alert that had brought him upstairs in the first place. Facts only, no interpretation. He submitted the report through internal channels before noon. By the afternoon, nothing happened. No acknowledgement, no follow-up. The system confirmed receipt, then fell silent. Dan finished his shift and left. He and Rex walked the waterfront instead of heading home. Salt air helped clear his head. Gulls cried overhead. The city moved on, unaware of decisions being weighed somewhere above. That night, his phone buzzed. Human Resources requested a meeting. The room was small and windowless, beige walls. A round table meant to feel cooperative. Across from Dan sat a woman he hadn't met before. Linda Park, early 40s. HR compliance manager. Neat black hair pulled into a low bun. Neutral makeup. Calm eyes that measured before responding. "Mr. Mercer," she said, folding her hands. "This is just a routine follow-up." Dan nodded. Rex lay at his feet, still as stone. Linda smiled politely. "Your report mentioned audio capture." "Yes, ma'am." "Our understanding is that audio recording is not part of your assigned duties." Dan met her gaze. The camera was already active. She studied him for a moment longer. "We've reviewed the footage. There appears to be no immediate safety concern." Dan felt a slow burn in his chest. Not anger. Disappointment. "With respect," he said, "there will be." Linda's smile thinned. "We appreciate your diligence. However, certain matters are above your clearance. For now, you're being placed on temporary administrative leave while we review procedures." The words were smooth, practiced. Dan signed the form. He had learned not to argue with paperwork. Outside, he stared at the copied files on his laptop, the timestamp glowing in the dim room. He thought about the workers on the docks, men he nodded to every night, men who trusted the equipment to hold. He had followed procedure. He had done everything right. And still, the plan moved forward. Dan closed the laptop. If they believed silence would protect them, they were wrong. Some regrets did not wait for permission. The waiting edge. Wind rolled in from the bay, sharp and damp, rattling loose signs along the Tacoma docks and driving sheets of rain sideways against the warehouses. Daniel Mercer stood beneath the awning of his apartment building, red and black flannel buttoned high against the cold. The fabric pulled tight across his shoulders as he shifted his weight, favoring the right leg. The left answered with a dull reminder. He ignored it. Pain had never been a reason to stop. Rex sat at his heel, posture perfect, eyes tracking the street. The black harness stayed on. Service dog, do not pet. It wasn't for strangers. It was for Dan. A line drawn. A promise kept. Administrative leave felt heavier than any night shift. No routes to walk. No cameras to check. Too much time to think. Dan had spent the morning reviewing procedures in his head, not for Harborline, but for himself. What he could do. What he could not. He had followed protocol. He had documented. He had reported. The system had closed ranks. That left waiting. Inside the building, the elevator groaned as it climbed. Dan watched the numbers tick upward, listening to the faint hum of machinery. Rex's ears flicked at each stop. On the third floor, Dan stepped out into the administrative wing. He had been told to return his access badge. Nothing more. The hallway looked the same as always. Clean, quiet, neutral. It was designed to forget footsteps. As they approached the security office, a door opened down the hall. Evan Brooks emerged, phone in hand. The CFO looked thinner in daylight, his suit hanging just a little loose. Wireframe glasses perched on his nose. His expression was distracted, fingers tapping as he read something Dan could not see. Evan glanced up and froze for half a second too long. "Mercer," he said, forcing a nod. "Didn't expect to see you." "Just turning in my badge," Dan replied. Evan smiled, quick and brittle. "Of course. Procedures." The man stepped aside, giving Rex a wide berth. His eyes flicked to the harness, then away. Evan was the kind who noticed symbols, but never understood them. As Evan walked off, his shoulders were tense. Not fear, pressure. The weight of numbers that no longer added up. Dan handed over the badge to a junior supervisor who avoided eye contact. Paperwork was signed, a process completed. Outside again, Dan leaned against the railing overlooking the docks. Cranes moved in the distance, slow and methodical. Work continued. Always did. Rex pressed closer, a silent question. "I know," Dan murmured. He thought about the men in the conference room, how easily they spoke of timelines and tolerances, how none of them had named the worker who would be standing beneath that container when the plan went live. Back home, Dan brewed coffee he did not want and stared at the rain streaking down the window. He replayed Caleb Monroe's words from the lobby. Quiet is valuable. It was not a threat, it was a test. Dan failed tests like that on purpose. His phone rang just after noon. Unknown number. Dan answered without greeting. "Mr. Mercer," the voice said. Smooth, measured, older. Thomas Hale. Dan had never spoken to him directly before. He knew the voice from quarterly briefings broadcast over internal channels. Calm authority. The sound of a man used to outcomes bending his way. "I understand you're feeling unsettled," Thomas said. "That happens when good employees misinterpret things." Dan said nothing. "We value loyalty here," Thomas continued. And discretion. I wanted to assure you that no one is in danger. Dan looked down at Rex, at the steady rise and fall of the dog's chest. With respect, Dan said, that's not true. A pause, just long enough. You're a veteran, Thomas said. You understand sacrifice, risk. Sometimes decisions look ugly up close. Dan felt the familiar tightening behind his eyes. Memories surfaced uninvited, places where the word sacrifice had been used to cover someone else's mistake. I understand responsibility, Dan said. Not excuses. Thomas sighed softly. You're placing yourself in a difficult position. So are you, Dan replied. The call ended without goodbye. The afternoon dragged. Rain eased, then returned harder. Dan watched the clock, not because he wanted the time to pass, but because he wanted it to stop. Near dusk, his phone buzzed again. This time, a text. Maintenance incident reported. Minor delay. Operations unaffected. Dan closed his eyes. They had started adjusting the system. Small changes. Testing boundaries. He pulled on his jacket and clipped Rex's leash shorter. They drove back toward Harbor Line without a plan beyond observation. Dan parked across the street, engine off. From here, he could see the loading bays. Trucks moved in and out, schedules tight. Rex stiffened suddenly, a low sound rumbling in his chest. Dan followed his gaze. Caleb Monroe stood near the edge of Bay 4, phone to his ear, gesturing sharply at a supervisor. Even from a distance, Dan could read the posture. Control slipping, anger contained. For the first time since the hallway, Dan felt something close to certainty. They were rushing. Men who rushed made mistakes. Dan stayed where he was, watched, waited. Whatever happened next would not take long. And when it did, it would not ask for permission. The accident that came early. The rain stopped just before dawn, leaving the harbor slick and shining under cold white lights. The air heavy with salt and unfinished business. Daniel Mercer arrived at Bay 4 before the alarms did. He wore the same red and black flannel, damp at the cuffs, boots planted wide on the concrete. Rex walked tight at his side, the German shepherd's black and tan coat darkened by mist. The black harness was secured, the warning clear. Service dog, do not pet. Dan had not planned to be here. Not officially. Administrative leave still stood. But habit pulled him back, and instinct confirmed it. The docks felt wrong. Forklifts moved too fast. Supervisors spoke too sharply. A container crane loomed overhead, its steel frame creaking under a load that should have been delayed, not moved before sunrise. Dan scanned the bay, eyes measuring angles and distances the way they always had. He spotted Caleb Monroe near the loading line, suit jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow. The COO looked different up close, less polished, jaw tight. A man trying to control timing instead of people. Caleb barked an order. A supervisor hesitated. Now, Caleb snapped, before shift change. That was the mistake. The crane lurched, metal screamed. Dan's body moved before thought caught up. He grabbed the nearest worker and shoved him backward as a container swung wide, its locking pins failing with a sharp crack. The massive steel box dropped, clipping the loading platform, then collapsing inward with brutal force. The impact knocked the breath from everyone nearby. Dust and steam filled the air. Rex lunged forward, straining against the leash, ears flat, eyes locked on the wreckage. Dan ran. Caleb Monroe was down. The COO lay trapped beneath a twisted section of frame, one leg pinned at an unnatural angle. Blood soaked into the concrete beneath him, dark and spreading. His face, usually calm, was pale and slick with sweat. When he saw Dan, something in his eyes broke. "Help me," Caleb said, his voice cracked. "Please." Dan dropped to one knee, already assessing. Breathing, circulation, crush injury risk. He had done this before. Not here, but in places that smelled worse and sounded louder. Rex stood guard, body rigid, a wall between Caleb and the chaos. "Stay still," Dan said. "You hear me? You stay still." Caleb laughed weakly. You were right to report it. I should have listened." Dan ignored the words. Regret spoken under pressure meant nothing. Action mattered. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had finally hit the alarm. "I can fix this," Caleb gasped. "I can make this right. You don't have to say anything." Dan looked at him then. Really looked. Caleb Monroe was not evil in a theatrical way. He was practical, comfortable. A man who believed distance protected him from consequence. Dan applied pressure, stabilized what he could, and spoke clearly into his radio, calling for medical support. He did not bargain. He did not threaten. He did his job. Emergency crews arrived within minutes. Paramedics took over, voices brisk, movements efficient. Police followed, eyes sharp, questions forming. Dan stepped back, Rex still at heel. An officer approached. Sergeant Michael Torres, mid-40s, broad build, close-cropped hair, calm demeanor. A man used to separating panic from fact. "You were first on scene?" Torres asked. "Yes," Dan said. "Name?" "Daniel Mercer." Torres nodded. "You work here?" "Security." Torres glanced at Rex, then back at Dan. "You see what happened?" Dan met his eyes. "I saw the order given." Torres did not press yet. He knew timing. By mid-morning, the bay was sealed. Operations halted. Executives whispered in clusters. Evan Brooks stood near the office doors, hands shaking as he typed furiously on his phone. His glasses slid down his nose. He pushed them back without noticing. Thomas Hale arrived late. The vice chairman stepped out of a black sedan, posture upright, expression composed. Silver hair perfect. Eyes scanning for damage, not people. When his gaze found Dan, it lingered for a fraction too long. Thomas walked over. "Mr. Mercer," he said, voice smooth. "I'm sorry you had to see this." Dan said nothing. "Accidents happen," Thomas continued. "We'll handle it." Dan looked past him, at the wrecked crane, the blood-stained concrete, the workers standing in stunned silence. "No," Dan said quietly. "This wasn't an accident." Thomas's smile did not falter, but his eyes hardened. "We can discuss this later." "There won't be a later," Dan replied. Thomas turned away. By noon, investigators were everywhere. OSHA, internal auditors, police, data requests flooded the system. Logs were pulled, timelines questioned, and the camera feed from the third floor surfaced. The one Dan had repaired. The audio was unmistakable. By the time Caleb Monroe was wheeled into surgery, handcuffed to the gurney, the story had already begun to unravel. Orders traced back, emails flagged, authorizations exposed. Instant regret did not come with drama. It came with timestamps. Dan sat on the edge of the loading dock, exhaustion settling into his bones. Rex lay beside him, head on his boot. "You did good," a paramedic said in passing. Dan did not answer. He watched as men who once spoke in quiet confidence now argued in raised voices. He watched control slip from hands that had never expected resistance. The sun rose higher, bright and unforgiving. Dan knew this was not the end, but it was the point of no return. They had rushed, and the cost had arrived sooner than planned. The cost paid in full. Morning broke clear and sharp, sunlight cutting across the harbor as if nothing had ever gone wrong. Daniel Mercer stood outside Bay 4, hands buried in the pockets of his red and black flannel, watching investigators move with careful precision. The rain was gone. The concrete had been scrubbed, but the place still felt marked. Rex sat at his side, calm, alert, the black harness snug against his chest. "Service dog, do not pet." The words drew glances now, respectful ones. Dan felt older than he had a week ago. The accident had ended the moment it began. Everything after was consequence. Caleb Monroe survived surgery. Barely. When he woke, tubes threaded through his body, wrists cuffed to the bed. He learned the truth in pieces. The crane logs, the authorization trail, the audio from the conference room. His own voice, calm and confident, explaining how a man could be sacrificed for efficiency. Regret came to him in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and fear. Evan Brooks lasted longer. The CFO sat in a glass-walled office surrounded by screens, insisting the numbers had been misunderstood. His composure cracked when federal investigators arrived with a warrant. He was led out past employees he had never learned the names of, his glasses trembling on his nose. Thomas Hale watched it all unravel from a distance. For 2 days, the vice chairman said nothing. On the third, he attempted control. Statements, legal teams, carefully worded denials. They failed. Emails surfaced, meeting records, deleted files recovered. The kind of quiet evidence that did not argue. By Friday afternoon, Harborline Logistics suspended its executive board. Operations halted. Stock froze. Dan was called in to give a formal statement. The room was larger than the HR office had been. Windows this time. 2 investigators sat across from him. 1 man, 1 woman. Both attentive. No smiles. They asked questions. Dan answered simply. What he heard, what he saw, when he reported, when he was ignored. They did not ask why he stayed silent afterward. They understood waiting. When it was over, the woman closed her folder. "You did everything right, Mr. Mercer." Dan nodded once. Outside, Rex stretched and shook himself as if shedding a long-held tension. That evening, Sergeant Torres found Dan near the docks. "They're charging Monroe with criminal negligence," Torres said, "among other things." Dan watched the water ripple against the pier. Torres hesitated. "You could have walked away." Dan shrugged. "So could they." Torres studied him for a moment, then nodded. "That's usually the difference." The news broke quietly. No press conference, no apology that mattered. Workers were told the truth in plain language. What had been planned, what had happened instead. Some cried, some swore. Most were simply tired. Harborline rehired Dan the following Monday, not as a guard, as lead safety and compliance officer. The offer came from interim management, hands shaking slightly as they slid the paperwork across the table. It came with an apology, an unspoken one. The kind people gave when they realized who had been standing in front of them all along. Dan read the contract once, signed it. No negotiation. He walked the floor that night in the same flannel, boots echoing softly. Rex moved with him, unchanged. Nothing about the work felt different, but everything else did. Men looked up now when he passed, not because they were afraid, because they remembered. On a quiet evening near the end of the week, Dan found himself standing alone at Bay 4. The crane stood idle, locked down, tagged with warnings. The space felt larger without motion. He thought of Caleb Monroe, staring at a hospital ceiling. Of Evan Brooks, memorizing legal advice he should have learned sooner. Of Thomas Hale, finally understanding that authority did not equal immunity. Instant regret was not dramatic. It was precise. Rex nudged Dan's hand with his nose. "Yeah," Dan murmured. "Time to go." They walked toward the parking lot as the sun dipped low, painting the harbor gold. Behind them, Harbor Line continued to exist, scarred, wiser. Dan did not believe in happy endings. He believed in endings that made sense. This one did. Sometimes the miracle is not loud. It does not fall from the sky or arrive with signs and wonders. Sometimes the miracle is simply a moment when the truth is revealed at the exact second it must be. Faith does not always mean waiting. Sometimes faith means standing still, doing the right thing, and trusting that God sees what others choose to ignore. In everyday life, in ordinary jobs, in quiet choices, His justice moves faster than we expect. What happened here reminds us that no one is invisible to God, not the powerful, not the humble, and never the ones who choose integrity when silence would be easier. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and tell us what you believe real courage looks like. Subscribe for more stories that remind us faith still matters. May God bless you and keep you safe.